At his brother's funeral, Ethan didn't cry, but the little girl beside him never let go of his hand. And that same night, they drove to a dying farm everyone said was cursed, where the wind whispered through broken wood, and his dog Ranger suddenly froze, ears sharp, staring at the ground like it was alive. Days later, just as Ethan decided to leave, Ranger started digging in the pouring rain, uncovering a hidden hatch buried deep beneath the barn, and inside wasn't money, but something his brother had died protecting, something that could change everything or destroy what little they had left. Some promises aren't spoken out loud, they're carried in silence. The wind moved low across the cemetery, brushing over rows of pale headstones as if it remembered every name carved into them. And Ethan Cole stood still with his hands in his coat pockets, not because he was cold, but because he didn't know where else to put them, while beside him a small hand gripped his sleeve with quiet determination, not trembling, not pulling away, just holding on as if letting go might make everything disappear again. And when he finally looked down, Lily Harper didn't look up at him the way children usually did. There was no question in her eyes, no tears, just a stillness too heavy for someone her age, as if she had already understood something the world hadn't explained yet. And behind them, Ranger sat in the damp grass, ears tilted toward the horizon, not the ceremony, not the voices, but something farther away, something deeper, the kind of silence that settles before a storm you can't see yet. And when the last car left and the gravel road fell quiet again, Ethan didn't say a word. He just walked to the old truck, opened the passenger door, and waited, and Lily climbed in without asking where they were going. Because sometimes children don't need answers, they just need someone who doesn't leave. And the drive took nearly 2 hours north, past fading towns and rusted fences, until the road turned narrow and the trees began to close in like they were guarding something forgotten. And when the farm finally appeared, it didn't look abandoned so much as unfinished, like it had been waiting for something that never came. The barn leaned slightly to one side. The porch sagged under years of weather, and the fields stretched out in uneven patches of dry earth and stubborn weeds. And for a moment, Ethan just sat there with the engine idling, watching the place his brother had refused to give up, even when everything else had already slipped away. And beside him, Lily pressed her palm softly against the window, eyes fixed on the broken land as if she recognized it, not as it was, but as it had once been. And Ranger stepped down from the truck slowly, paws crunching against gravel, his nose lifting into the cold air, and then he stopped, completely still, ears forward, body tense, staring toward the far edge of the property where the ground dipped slightly behind the barn. And Ethan followed his gaze but saw nothing, just dirt, wind, and the quiet kind of emptiness that settles into places people stop believing in. But Ranger didn't move, didn't blink, as if the earth itself had just whispered something only he could hear. And in that moment, standing between what was lost and what hadn't been found yet, Ethan felt something shift, not loud, not sudden, just a small, steady feeling that maybe this place wasn't as empty as it looked, and maybe his brother hadn't held on for no reason at all. Grief does not always sound like crying. Sometimes it sounds like a house that has forgotten how to breathe. The first night on the farm came quietly, without ceremony, as if the land itself was waiting to see whether they would stay or turn back before morning. And Ethan moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps, boots brushing against warped floorboards that groaned under his weight, each sound echoing longer than it should have in the hollow rooms, while Lily followed close behind, not asking questions, not wandering off, just watching everything with that same steady gaze that felt older than her years. And Ranger stayed near the doorway at first, his body angled toward the outside as if he had not yet decided whether this place was safe enough to enter. The wind slipping through cracks in the walls carrying the faint scent of dry wood, and something colder beneath it, something mineral, like earth that had not been turned in a long time. And when Ethan finally set down the small duffel bag he had brought, it felt less like arriving, and more like pausing in the middle of something unfinished, as if the house had been holding its breath long before they ever stepped inside. And even now it was not sure if it should exhale. And Lily drifted toward the far wall where an old photograph hung crooked, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame as if she recognized the faces without needing to remember them. and Ethan watched her for a moment before turning away, because some kinds of silence were not meant to be interrupted. And outside, the last light of the day stretched thin across the fields, fading into a soft gray that blurred the line between sky and ground. And that was when Ranger finally stepped in, one paw at a time, slow and measured, his nose low, tracing invisible paths along the floor, pausing now and then as if listening not with his ears, but with something deeper, something that responded to the shape of the space itself. And he moved through the house without hesitation, past the kitchen with its rusted sink, past the narrow hallway that bent slightly to the left, until he reached the back door that opened toward the barn. And there he stopped again, completely still, the same way he had earlier, his ears forward, his body tense but not afraid, just aware, and Ethan felt it too then, not as a sound or a movement, but as a subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a memory surfaces, when you can feel it coming but cannot yet see it clearly. And he stepped outside, pulling his jacket tighter as the cold settled in deeper, the barn standing a few yards away, its wood darkened by years of weather, the roof sagging slightly under its own weight, and the ground around it uneven, as if something beneath had once pushed upward and then settled back down again. And Ranger moved ahead of him, slow at first, then more certain, his path not random but guided, tracing a loose arc toward the far side where the land dipped just enough to collect shadows even before the sun had fully set. And Ethan followed, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, the smell of damp soil rising faintly as he walked. And when Ranger reached the edge of that shallow dip, he stopped once more, lowering his head, pressing his nose close to the ground, inhaling deeply as if reading something written beneath the surface. And then he looked back at Ethan, not with confusion, but with expectation, as if this was not the first time he had found something like this, only the first time Ethan had been asked to notice. And for a moment neither of them moved, the wind quieting just enough that the entire farm seemed to settle into a deeper stillness. And Ethan crouched down, placing his gloved hand against the cold dirt, feeling nothing at first except the rough texture of dry soil and small stones. But then, faintly, there was something else, not a vibration exactly, not a sound, just a subtle resistance, as if the ground beneath his palm held a shape that did not belong to the surface. And he pulled his hand back slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air, his thoughts turning in quiet circles, because this was the kind of thing his brother would have noticed, the kind of detail he would have followed without needing a reason. And for the first time since arriving, Ethan felt something that was not just responsibility or grief, but curiosity, thin and uncertain, like a thread he was not sure he should pull. And behind him, Lily had stepped out onto the porch without him noticing, standing there in the dim light, watching both of them with that same calm expression, her small hands wrapped around the wooden railing. And when Ethan glanced back, their eyes met for a brief moment, and she did not ask what he had found. She simply nodded once, as if she already understood that whatever it was, it mattered, and maybe that was enough for now. Because some answers do not come all at once, they rise slowly, like something buried waiting for the right hands to uncover them. And as the last light disappeared and the first stars began to show faintly above the tree-line, Ethan stood there between the barn and the house, between what had been left behind and what had yet to be revealed, with a dog who could hear what he could not and a child who seemed to feel what he had forgotten how to trust. And somewhere beneath his feet, hidden in the quiet earth, something remained, not calling out, not demanding to be found, just waiting, patient in the way only time can be, for someone willing to stay long enough to listen. Sometimes the past does not stay buried because it wants to be found, but because it is waiting for someone who will not run from it. The morning came slowly over the farm, not with brightness but with a thin gray light that stretched across the fields like a memory that had faded but refused to disappear. And Ethan woke before the sun fully rose, not because he had rested, but because the silence here was different, heavier, pressing gently against his chest until sleep could no longer hold him. And for a moment he lay still on the narrow couch, listening, expecting the familiar sounds of distant traffic or early voices that never came. Only the soft creak of wood adjusting to the cold and the faint whistle of wind slipping through unseen cracks. And somewhere beyond the walls, Ranger was already awake, his paws shifting against the ground with quiet purpose. And when Ethan stepped outside, the air carried that same cool, mineral scent from the night before, sharper now, as if the earth itself had exhaled something it could not keep hidden any longer. And the barn stood where it had been, unchanged, yet somehow more present, like a shape that only revealed itself when you stopped looking directly at it. And Ranger was there again, not wandering, not distracted, but standing at the edge of that shallow dip behind the structure, his posture steady, his gaze fixed downward. And Ethan did not call out this time, did not question it. He simply walked toward him, each step slower than the last, as if the ground beneath him might shift if he moved too quickly. And when he reached the spot, he crouched again, brushing away a thin layer of loose dirt with his bare hand, the soil cool and slightly damp beneath the surface. And this time the resistance was clearer, not imagined, not uncertain. Something solid lay just beneath, something shaped by intention rather than chance. And he exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the house where Lily now stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket too large for her shoulders, her hair catching the pale morning light. And she did not speak, she only watched, the way she had been watching everything, as if the world had become something she needed to study carefully before trusting again. And Ethan looked back down, his fingers tracing the outline beneath the soil, a faint edge, straight, unnatural, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this was the kind of discovery that changed things, the kind that turned a place from something temporary into something that asked you to stay. And he had not decided yet if he was ready for that. But Ranger shifted slightly, a low sound rising in his chest, not a warning, not urgency, just insistence. And that was enough. And Ethan stood, walking back toward the barn, searching through what little had been left behind until he found an old shovel leaning against the wall, its handle worn smooth by years of use. And when he returned, the rhythm of digging came naturally, steady, controlled, the same quiet focus he had carried through other parts of his life, the kind that did not allow room for doubt once it had begun. And the soil gave way more easily than he expected, as if it had not been packed down by time, but simply laid there to cover something waiting beneath. And after a few minutes, the edge became clearer, a wooden surface, weathered but intact, its grain darkened by years underground. And Ethan brushed the dirt aside with both hands now, revealing more of it, the outline forming into something unmistakable, a hatch, rectangular, deliberate, and built with care. And he sat back on his heels, his breath visible in the cool air, his thoughts quieting in a way that felt unfamiliar, because this was no longer just a broken farm, no longer just a place his brother had refused to leave. This was a question, one that had been waiting long before Ethan ever arrived. And behind him, small footsteps approached, careful but unafraid, and Lily came to stand beside him, her blanket trailing slightly in the dirt, her eyes fixed on the uncovered wood. And after a moment, she knelt down too, her small hand reaching out to touch the surface, her fingers tracing the edge the same way as had. And then she looked up at him, not with uncertainty, but with something quieter, something steadier, and she spoke for the first time since they had arrived, her voice soft but clear. In the still morning air, he said, the ground remembers. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, not quite grief, but recognition, because that sounded like his brother, the way he used to talk when things did not make sense yet still felt true. And Ethan nodded slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the hatch, the wood cool beneath his palm. And for a moment none of them moved, not Ethan, not Lily, not even Ranger, who stood just behind them, watching, waiting, as if he had already done his part, and now it was up to them to decide what came next. And the farm around them remained still, the wind holding its breath, the fields stretching out in quiet expectation. And Ethan realized then that whatever lay beneath that hatch was not just something his brother had hidden, it was something he had chosen to leave behind, not for anyone, but for someone who would understand why it mattered. And standing there with a child who trusted without asking, and a dog who listened to things he could not hear, Ethan felt the weight of that choice settle in, not heavy, but certain, like a path that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice. And slowly, with a steady breath, he reached for the edge of the hatch, ready to see what the ground had been keeping all this time. Some doors are not locked to keep people out. but to make sure only the right hands opened them. Ethan did not pull the hatch open right away, his fingers resting on the edge as if the wood itself carried a weight heavier than it should, and for a moment he simply stayed there, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, the way the air seemed to hold still around them, as though the farm was watching what he would do next, and beside him Lily remained quiet, her small hand still touching the surface, her presence steady in a way that made the moment feel less uncertain, while Ranger shifted slightly behind them, his breath slow and controlled, his eyes fixed on the hatch with a focus that was not driven by fear, but by recognition, as if whatever lay beneath was not unknown to him, only unseen until now, and Ethan finally tightened his grip and lifted, the wood resisting at first with a faint pull of damp earth before giving way with a low, hollow sound that echoed softly into the space below, and as the hatch opened fully, a breath of cool air rose from the darkness beneath, carrying with it a scent unlike the dry soil above, something older, cleaner, touched by stone and time rather than decay, and the opening revealed a narrow set of wooden steps descending into shadow, each one worn but intact, built with care rather than haste, and Ethan leaned slightly forward, peering down, but the light from above only reached a few feet before dissolving into gray, and for a moment he hesitated again, not because he feared what was there, but because stepping down meant accepting that whatever he found would change the story he had been telling himself about this place. And behind him the wind moved gently across the fields, brushing against the barn as if urging him forward without making a sound, and Lily shifted closer, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. He went down there, and Ethan glanced at her, surprised not by the words but by the certainty in them, as if she was not guessing but remembering something she had never been told, and he nodded slowly, his decision settling into place not as a sudden choice, but as something that had already been made the moment he chose to stay, and he reached back toward the barn, retrieving a small flashlight from the truck, its beam narrow but steady when he tested it. And then he returned to the opening, lowering one foot onto the first step, the wood firm beneath his weight, followed by the second, and then the third, each movement deliberate, measured, the way he had learned to move through unknown spaces where attention mattered more than speed. And as he descended, the light from above faded behind him, replaced by the softer glow of the flashlight cutting through the dimness, revealing walls lined not with dirt, but with carefully set stone, each piece fitted with intention, forming a passage that felt less like a hidden pit and more like a place meant to be entered. And the air grew cooler with each step, carrying a faint echo of something steady, not a sound exactly, but a presence, like the quiet rhythm of water somewhere out of sight. And when his boots reached the bottom, the space opened slightly, enough for him to stand upright, the ceiling just high enough to avoid brushing his head, and he turned slowly, the beam of light revealing a small chamber carved with the same care as the steps, its walls smooth in places and rough in others, as if shaped over time rather than all at once. And against the far side stood a wooden table, simple but sturdy, its surface covered with items that had been placed there deliberately, not stored, not forgotten, but arranged, and Ethan stepped closer, his breath steady, his hand lowering the flashlight just enough to see more clearly. And there, resting at the center, was a worn leather notebook, its edges softened by use, beside it a folded map, yellowed with age but still intact, and a small metal box that reflected the light in a muted, steady way. And nothing about it felt random, nothing about it felt abandoned, and behind him he heard the soft creak of wood above as Lily moved closer to the opening, her small voice drifting down. "Is it there?" And Ethan looked around once more, taking in the quiet, the order, the sense that this place had been waiting, and he answered gently, yes, though he was not entirely sure what he was confirming, only that something important had been found. And as he reached for the notebook, his fingers pausing just before touching it, he realized that whatever his brother had left behind was not meant to be hidden forever. It was meant to be understood, and that understanding would not come all at once, but step by step, like the descent he had just taken, guided not by certainty, but by the willingness to keep going. And above him the light from the open hatch remained, a quiet connection between what was known and what had just begun to reveal itself. And for the first time since arriving, Ethan did not feel like he was standing in someone else's unfinished story. He felt like he had just stepped into the beginning of something his brother had trusted him to continue. Not everything left behind is meant to be taken. Some things are meant to be understood first. Ethan's fingers finally closed around the worn leather notebook, lifting it carefully as if it might fall apart under the weight of time. But it held firm, the cover bending slightly as he opened it, releasing a faint scent of paper and something older, like the quiet persistence of years spent waiting in the dark. And the first page was filled with handwriting he recognized immediately, not because it was neat or perfect, but because it carried the same steady rhythm his brother had always spoken with. Each word deliberate, each line spaced as if written by someone who knew exactly how much room he had left, and Ethan's breath slowed as he began to read, the flashlight resting against the table casting a soft glow across the page while the rest of the chamber remained wrapped in shadow. And the words did not begin with explanation or instruction. They began with something simpler. If you are reading this, it means you chose to stay. And Ethan paused there, his thumb resting lightly against the edge of the paper, because that single sentence felt less like a note, and more like a quiet acknowledgement, as if his brother had known this moment would come but had never tried to force it. And he turned the page slowly, the paper soft beneath his fingers, and the next line spoke of the land. Not as property or burden, but as something alive in its own quiet way, something that had once provided more than it seemed capable of now. And as Ethan read, the words painted a picture of years spent trying to understand what lay beneath the surface, not just the soil, but the way the ground held moisture even in dry seasons, the way certain patches of grass refused to wither when everything else turned brittle and gray. And his brother had written about following those signs, about digging in places that felt wrong at first, but revealed something steady underneath, something that could not be seen from above. And Ethan's eyes moved faster now, drawn in not by urgency, but by the growing sense that this was not just a record of effort, it was a map of intention. And he reached for the folded paper beside the notebook, unfolding it carefully to reveal a hand-drawn layout of the farm, marked with small symbols and lines that traced paths he had not noticed before. And at the center of it all was the barn, with a circle drawn just behind it, the same place where Ranger had stopped, the same place where the hatch had been hidden. And from that circle, faint lines extended outward, branching like veins through the land. And Ethan leaned closer, the beam of the flashlight catching the edges of those markings. And that was when he understood, not all at once, but enough to feel the shift. This was not just a hidden room. It was part of something larger, something his brother had been trying to protect, not from people, but from being lost entirely. And a soft sound above pulled his attention upward, Lily's voice again, quieter this time. "What does it say?" And Ethan glanced toward the opening, the rectangle of pale light still visible above him. And he answered after a moment, his voice calm, but carrying a weight he had not expected. He was trying to save it, and the words settled into the space between them, not fully explained, but understood in the way that mattered. And Ethan returned his gaze to the table, his hand moving now to the small metal box, its surface cool beneath his touch. And when he opened it, the hinge gave with a soft click, revealing a set of neatly folded documents, each one protected carefully. And as he lifted the top sheet, he recognized official markings, land records, water rights, and something else, something more valuable than he had anticipated. Proof that beneath this farm ran a natural spring, steady and untouched, a source of life that could restore the land if it was cared for properly. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, because this was what his brother had been holding on to, not out of stubbornness, but out of belief. Belief that something broken could still be brought back if someone was willing to understand it rather than abandon it. And behind him, Ranger's paws shifted on the wooden steps above, a soft echo that carried down into the chamber, not restless, not impatient, just present, as if reminding him that this discovery was not the end of something, but the beginning. And Ethan closed the box carefully, placing it back on the table before picking up the notebook once more, turning to the final pages where the handwriting had grown slightly less steady but no less clear. And there, in the last lines, his brother had written something that made Ethan pause again, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that left no room for doubt. The farm is not broken. It is waiting for someone who listens. and Ethan lowered the notebook slowly, the words echoing quietly in his mind as he stood there beneath the surface of the land that had once felt empty. And for the first time since stepping onto this property, he did not see a place that needed to be fixed. He saw something that needed to be understood, and above him the light from the open hatch remained steady, Lily still waiting, the world above unchanged, yet somehow different now that he knew what lay beneath it. And Ethan reached for the flashlight, turning toward the steps with the notebook in his hand, knowing that when he climbed back up, he would not be the same man who had arrived the night before. Because some truths do not change the world around you. They change the way you choose to stay in it. The hardest part is not finding the truth. It is choosing what to do once you understand it. When Ethan climbed back up through the hatch, the morning light felt different, not brighter, not warmer, but clearer, as if something inside him had shifted just enough to change how the world settled around him. And Lily was still there, sitting on the edge of the opening with her blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her eyes meeting his the moment he emerged, not searching for answers, but for something steadier, something she could hold on to without needing it explained. And Ranger stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed now, the tension gone from his frame, as if whatever had been waiting beneath the ground had finally been acknowledged. And Ethan placed the notebook gently on the wooden boards beside the hatch before pulling himself fully out, his boots brushing against loose dirt as he stood, taking in a slow breath of the cool morning air. And for a moment none of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy but settled, like a space that had finally found its shape. And Lily shifted closer, her gaze dropping briefly to the notebook before returning to him, and she asked quietly, "Was he right?" And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the question carried more than it seemed, and he glanced out across the field, the uneven patches of land stretching out beneath the pale sky, the barn casting a long shadow that reached almost to where they stood, and he thought about the lines on the map, the way they branched outward, unseen beneath the surface. And then he nodded once, slow and certain. Yeah, he was. And the words felt simple, but they carried something deeper, something that settled into place as he spoke them. And Lily exhaled softly, not in relief, but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for that confirmation, not to believe it, but to feel less alone in already knowing it. And Ethan reached down, closing the hatch with care, the wood fitting back into place with a quiet finality that did not feel like closing something off, but preserving it. And then he stood there for a moment longer, his hand resting on the surface as if committing its presence to memory. And when he stepped back, something inside him resisted the idea of leaving it untouched, not out of fear, but because he understood now that this was not something meant to remain hidden forever. It was something meant to be used, slowly, carefully, the way his brother had intended. And Ranger moved first, trotting a few steps toward the field before pausing and looking back, not with urgency, but with a calm expectation. And Ethan followed his gaze, then turned to Lily. "Come on," he said softly, and together they walked out across the uneven ground, the morning light stretching thin over the land. And as they moved, Ethan began to notice things he had not seen before, subtle changes in the texture of the soil, faint differences in color where the grass grew slightly thicker, and he realized that the map was not just a guide to what was below. It was a way of seeing what was already there, hidden in plain sight. And Ranger led them to a small patch where the earth dipped almost imperceptibly, the grass here greener, softer underfoot, and Ethan crouched, brushing his hand across the surface, feeling the difference immediately, the soil cooler, holding moisture even in the dry air. And he looked back toward the barn, tracing the invisible line in his mind from the hatch to where he now knelt. And it made sense in a way that did not need explanation, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to notice what it had been quietly doing all along. And Lily knelt beside him, her small hand pressing into the ground the same way as had, and she smiled, just slightly, the first real change in her expression since they arrived. And it was not a wide smile, not something bright or loud, but something quiet and certain, like the beginning of trust returning. And Ethan felt that shift too, not as a sudden feeling, but as something that settled deeper with each passing moment. The understanding that this place was not asking to be fixed all at once, it was asking to be cared for, one step at a time. And as he stood again, The weight he had carried since the night before felt different, not gone, but shared, spread across something larger than just his own thoughts, and he looked out. Over the farm once more, the broken boards, the leaning structures, the dry patches that still needed work, and for the first time, none of it felt like a reason to leave. It felt like a reason to stay, and behind him, the barn stood quietly, the hatch hidden once more beneath the earth, holding its secret not as a burden, but as a promise, and above them the sky had begun to clear, the pale gray giving way to a softer blue, and the wind moved gently through the field, carrying with it the faintest hint of something new, not loud, not certain, but enough to be felt. And as Ethan watched Lily walk a few steps ahead with Ranger close beside her, her small figure moving with a steadiness that had not been there before, he understood that whatever his brother had left behind was not just meant to restore the land. It was meant to restore something in them too, something that could only grow if they were willing to remain. And for the first time since everything had changed, Ethan did not feel like he was holding on to something that was already lost. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something that had only just begun. Some changes do not arrive like storms, they come quietly, the way roots begin to grow beneath the surface. The days that followed did not feel dramatic or sudden, but something had shifted in the rhythm of the farm, a subtle change that Ethan could not point to directly, yet it followed him in small moments. In the way the morning air felt less empty when he stepped outside, in the way Lily no longer stayed near the doorway, but wandered a few steps farther each day, her presence moving gently through the space as if she was beginning to trust the ground beneath her feet. And Ranger, who had once paused and listened with tension, now moved with a calm certainty, his path no longer searching but knowing, as if whatever had called to him before had settled into something steady, something that no longer needed to be questioned, and Ethan found himself following that quiet shift, not forcing change, not trying to fix everything at once, but paying attention in ways he had not before, noticing how the light moved differently across the field in the early afternoon, how certain patches held their color longer than others, how the wind seemed to pass more gently through the barn as if the structure itself had begun to settle. And one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and stretched long shadows across the land, Ethan returned to the notebook, sitting on the worn steps of the porch with the pages open in his lap, reading more slowly this time, not searching for answers but allowing the words to unfold in their own time. And he began to see patterns he had missed before. Small notations in the margins, marks beside certain lines that matched the map he had unfolded earlier, and he realized that his brother had not just been documenting the land. He had been learning its language, translating something that could not be spoken into something that could be followed. And as Ethan traced those markings with his finger, he felt a quiet understanding begin to form, not complete, not certain, but enough to guide him forward. And behind him, Lily sat on the wooden step. Just above, her legs pulled close, watching the sky shift from pale blue to deeper shades of evening. And she spoke without looking at him, her voice soft but steady. It does not feel broken anymore. And Ethan closed the notebook slowly, resting it beside him as he looked out across the field. The same land that had seemed empty only days before now carrying a different weight, not heavier, but fuller, as if something beneath it had begun to rise, not physically, but in the way it held meaning, and he nodded slightly, more to himself than to her. It never was. And the words felt true in a way he had not expected, and for a moment they sat there together in silence, not the kind that pressed against you, but the kind that allowed space for something new to take shape. And Ranger lay stretched out near the edge of the porch, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but still aware, always aware, as if he was listening to something constant now, something that no longer needed to be discovered because it had become part of the rhythm of the place. And the air carried a faint warmth as the day settled into evening, the first hint that the season was beginning to shift. And Ethan stood after a while, stepping down from the porch and walking slowly toward the barn again, not with urgency, but with intention. And this time he did not go to the hatch. He moved past it, following one of the lines he had seen on the map, letting his steps be guided by observation rather than assumption. And as he reached the far side of the field, he stopped at another small dip in the land, less noticeable than the first, almost hidden unless you were looking for it. And he crouched, pressing his hand into the soil, feeling that same cool resistance beneath the surface, not as strong, but present, and he smiled slightly, not out of excitement, but out of recognition, because this was how it worked, not all at once, not in one place, but in a network of quiet connections that revealed themselves only when you paid attention. And behind him, he heard Lily's footsteps approach, lighter now, more certain, and she stood beside him, looking down at the ground with a calm curiosity, and Ranger followed, stopping just behind them, his ears tilting forward briefly before settling again, and Ethan looked at both of them, then back at the land stretching out ahead, and he understood that this was not just about uncovering what had been hidden, it was about learning how to see what had always been there. And as the last light faded and the sky deepened into night, the farm no longer felt like a place left behind. It felt like something in motion, something growing quietly beneath the surface, waiting not for someone to fix it, but for someone to walk it, to listen, and to stay long enough for its story to unfold. There are moments when the land stops being something you walk on, and becomes something that walks with you. The next morning arrived with a quiet warmth that had not been there before, the kind that settled gently over the farm as if the air itself had begun to soften, and Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped outside, the way the light touched the ground not as a harsh glare, but as something patient, something willing to wait, and Ranger was already moving along the edge of the field, not searching, not pausing, but tracing a path that seemed to follow the unseen lines Ethan had studied the night before. And Lily stood near the porch, her hands wrapped around a small tin cup of warm milk, watching both of them with a calm curiosity that no longer felt guarded, and Ethan walked out to join them, his boots pressing into the soil that now felt different beneath his feet, not dramatically changed, but subtly alive, as if the ground held more than just dryness now, and he followed Ranger's path, letting his steps fall naturally into the rhythm that had begun to form over the past few days. And as they reached the far side of the field, where the grass grew uneven but greener than before, Ranger slowed, his ears lifting slightly as he turned his head, not toward the ground this time, but toward a cluster of trees that marked the edge of the property, and Ethan paused, his gaze following the dog's line of sight, and there was nothing obvious there, just trees standing close together, their branches weaving shadows that shifted with the breeze. Yet something about the space felt different. Not empty, not forgotten, but held, like a place that had been waiting just outside of notice, and Lily stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. He used to go there, and Ethan glanced at her, the words settling into his thoughts without resistance, because they did not feel like a question, they felt like a piece of something already known, and he nodded once, then began walking toward the trees, Ranger moving ahead with a quiet certainty, and as they crossed into the shade, the air cooled slightly, carrying a faint scent of damp leaves and something else, something fresh beneath it, like water hidden just out of sight, and the ground beneath the trees was softer, less brittle than the open field, and Ethan felt it immediately, the way his steps sank just a little deeper, the way the soil seemed to hold moisture even where the sun rarely reached, and Ranger stopped near the center of the cluster, lowering his head and pressing his nose close to the ground, then lifting it again as if confirming what he had already sensed, and Ethan crouched beside him, brushing aside leaves and loose dirt with his hand, and there it was again, that same subtle resistance beneath the surface, not as defined as the hatch, not as deliberate, but present in a way that could not be ignored, and he exhaled slowly, his thoughts aligning with what he had read, the map, the lines, the way they extended outward from the barn. And he understood now that the underground chamber was not the source, it was a center, a point from which everything else connected. And this place beneath the trees was part of that network, a place where the hidden spring moved closer to the surface, feeding the land in ways that could not be seen but could be felt, and Lily knelt beside him, her fingers pressing lightly into the soil, and she smiled again, a little more this time, the expression still quiet but growing, like something learning how to return. And Ethan looked at her, then at Ranger, then back at the ground, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was uncovering something left behind. He felt like he was stepping into something still happening, something his brother had started but never finished, not because he failed, but because it was never meant to be finished by one person alone, And the realization did not come as a burden. It came as a kind of clarity, a steady understanding that this land was not asking to be restored overnight. It was asking for patience, for attention, for someone willing to continue what had already begun. And Ethan stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands as he looked out through the trees toward the open field beyond, the farm stretching out in quiet layers of possibility. And he could see it now, not clearly, not completely, but enough to believe in it. The way the water beneath the ground could be guided, the way the soil could be nurtured, back into something that held life again. And behind him, Ranger moved forward a few steps, then paused, looking back as if to say there was more to see, more to follow, and Lily stepped beside Ethan, her small hand slipping into his without hesitation. And together they stood there in the shade of the trees, the world around them no longer silent in the same way it had been before, but filled with a quiet movement that did not demand attention, only presence. And as the breeze shifted gently through the branches above, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing together, Ethan felt something settle deep within him, not a decision, but a knowing that whatever path lay ahead would not be walked alone, and that was enough to take the next step forward. Sometimes the truth does not reveal itself in what you find, but in what begins to change after you find it. The afternoon stretched long across the farm, carrying a quiet warmth that lingered in the soil and settled into the air like something patient, and Ethan moved through the land with a different awareness now, not searching for something hidden, but noticing what was already beginning to respond. The subtle way the grass near the tree line held its color even as the rest of the field remained uneven. The faint softness under his boots where the ground had once felt dry and resistant, and Ranger walked ahead with an easy confidence, no longer stopping to listen but occasionally glancing back as if to make sure Ethan was still following the path that had already been set in motion. And Lily stayed close beside him, her steps lighter now, her gaze no longer fixed on what was lost, but moving slowly across what was present, taking it in piece by piece, as if she was learning how to belong to this place rather than simply exist within it. And as they reached the edge of the field once more, Ethan paused, looking out over the land with a steady breath, the notebook's words echoing quietly in his thoughts, not as instructions, but as reminders. And he realized that what his brother had left behind was not a solution. It was a direction, something that required time, patience, and the willingness to stay even when the change was too small to measure at first. And that understanding settled into him with a quiet certainty, not overwhelming, not demanding, but present in a way that felt grounded. And he turned slightly, scanning the field again, letting his eyes move across the uneven terrain until they caught on something he had not noticed before, a faint line in the grass, barely visible unless you were looking for it, a subtle shift in color that traced a gentle curve from the trees toward the far side of the property. And he stepped forward, slowly, following that line, his boots pressing into the soil as he moved, the ground beneath him gradually softening, the air carrying that same faint scent of water just beneath the surface. And Ranger moved alongside him now, his pace matching Ethan's, his presence steady and calm, and Lily followed just behind, her small hand brushing lightly against the tall grass as they walked. And the line led them farther than Ethan expected, past the edges of the field he had already explored, toward a lower section of land where the ground dipped slightly and the grass grew thicker, greener. And as they reached it, Ethan stopped, crouching down once more, his hand pressing into the earth. And this time the difference was unmistakable, the soil cool and damp, holding moisture in a way that confirmed what he had begun to understand. And he looked up, his gaze moving outward across the land, tracing the invisible path from the barn to the trees to this place. And he saw it now, not just as a series of hidden points, but as a system, a quiet network that carried life beneath the surface, connecting everything in a way that could not be seen, but could be felt if you were willing to pay attention. And Lily knelt beside him again, her fingers sinking slightly into the soft ground, and she laughed softly, a sound so small it might have been missed if Ethan had not been listening. And it caught him off guard, not because it was loud, but because it was new, a sound that had not been there before. And he looked at her, a faint smile forming in response, not forced, not heavy, just present. And Ranger sat down beside them, his tail resting calmly against the grass, his ears relaxed, as if the urgency that had once guided him had now given way to something steadier. Something that no longer needed to be discovered because it had become part of the rhythm of their days. And Ethan stood slowly, his eyes scanning the land once more, and for the first time, he began to imagine what it could become, not in grand or distant terms, but in small, deliberate steps. The way water could be guided to nourish the driest patches, the way the soil could be turned and cared for until it began to hold life again. And the idea did not feel impossible, it felt earned, as if the land itself had revealed just enough to make the next step clear. And behind him, the barn stood quietly, the hatch hidden beneath the earth, holding its secrets not as something distant, but as something that continued to shape the present. And as the light shifted slowly toward evening, casting a golden hue across the field, Ethan realized that what had once felt like an ending had become something else entirely. Not a beginning in the way he expected, but a continuation of something that had never truly stopped. And as he turned back toward the house with Lily and Ranger beside him, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt open, not because he knew exactly where it would lead, but because he understood now that he did not need to. And that was enough to keep moving forward. What grows quietly is often what lasts the longest. The next few days did not arrive with sudden change, but with a steady unfolding that revealed itself in small, almost unnoticeable ways, the kind that only mattered if you were willing to pay attention. And Ethan found himself waking earlier each morning, not out of habit, but because something in the rhythm of the farm had begun to call him into. The day before the sun fully rose, and when he stepped outside, the air carried a softness that had not been there before, a faint warmth that lingered even in the cool edges of dawn. And Ranger would already be moving, his path no longer uncertain, his steps tracing the same invisible lines across the land, as if he was walking a pattern that had always existed but had only now become clear. And Lily would follow not far behind, her blanket no longer wrapped tightly around her shoulders but draped loosely, her movements quieter but more confident, as if each step she took was rooted in something deeper than fear. And Ethan began to work, not with urgency, not with the kind of force that tried to change everything at once, but with a patience that mirrored the land itself, starting with the areas he now understood held the most life beneath the surface, turning the soil carefully where it felt softest, guiding small channels where the moisture could travel more freely. And each movement felt less like labor and more like listening, as if the ground was offering quiet guidance in return for the attention he gave it. And there were moments when he would stop, not because he was tired, but because he could feel something shifting beneath his hands, a subtle change in the way the soil responded, the way it held together instead of crumbling apart. And those moments did not come with sound or spectacle. They came with a stillness that settled around him, the kind that made everything else fade for just a second, long enough for him to recognize that something was beginning to take hold. And one afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point and cast a steady light across the field, Ethan stood at the edge of the area he had been working on, his hands resting at his sides, his breath slow and even. And he could see it now, not clearly, not fully, but enough to know it was real. The faintest hint of green pushing through the soil where before there had only been dry earth. And it was not dramatic, not the kind of growth that demanded attention, but it was there, steady and undeniable. And he felt something in his chest ease in a way he had not noticed until it happened, a quiet release of something he had been holding onto without realizing it. And behind him, Lily's voice came softly. "It is starting." And he turned to see her standing a few steps away, her eyes fixed on the same patch of ground, her expression calm but certain. And Ethan nodded, not because he needed to confirm it, but because the moment felt like something that deserved acknowledgement. And Ranger stood between them, his gaze moving slowly across the field, his ears relaxed, his posture steady, as if he too recognized the shift, not as something new, but as something that had been waiting to be seen. And the wind moved gently through the farm, brushing across the grass and the wooden boards of the barn, carrying with it the faint sound of life returning in ways too quiet to name. And Ethan looked out over the land once more, the broken edges still visible, the work still ahead of him. But none of it felt overwhelming now, because he understood that the change did not need to happen all At once, it only needed to continue, one step at a time, guided by the same patience that had brought him here in the first place. And as the light began to soften into the early edges of evening, casting long shadows that stretched across the field, Ethan walked slowly back toward the house, Lily beside him, Ranger just ahead, and the farm no longer felt like a place caught in the past. It felt like something moving forward, quietly, steadily, the way all meaningful things do, not with noise, not with urgency, but with the kind of presence that only reveals itself to those who choose to stay long enough to see it grow. The truth does not always arrive as a discovery. Sometimes it arrives as a responsibility. The evening settled gently over the farm, the sky stretching wide in soft shades of gold and blue as the light lowered itself across the land. And Ethan stood near the edge of the field where the first signs of green had begun to show, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze steady, not searching, not questioning, but taking in what had already begun to change. And for the first time since everything had shifted in his life, he felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not relief, not certainty, but a quiet sense of direction, as if the path ahead no longer needed to be forced into existence. It only needed to be followed. And behind him, Lily moved slowly across the porch, her steps light, her movements no longer held back by hesitation. And Ranger lay near the base of the stairs, his body stretched comfortably along the wood, his eyes half open but aware, always aware, as if the rhythm of this place had become something he no longer needed to question. And Ethan turned slightly, watching Lily as she paused at the edge of the porch, her gaze moving out across the field. And for a moment she simply stood there, not speaking, not asking, just present in a way that felt complete. And then she stepped down, walking toward him without hurry, her small figure steady against the open space of the land. And when she reached him, she did not look up right away. She simply stood beside him, her shoulder brushing lightly against his arm. And after a moment she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "He knew you would stay." And Ethan felt the words settle into him with a weight that was not heavy, but undeniable. And he looked down at her, his expression softening slightly, not because he needed to reassure her, but because something in what she said felt true in a way that did not need to be explained. And he nodded once, slowly. "I think he hoped I would." And Lily glanced up at him then, her eyes steady. "That is the same thing." And Ethan let out a quiet breath, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to acknowledge the simple certainty in her words. And together they stood there in the fading light, the field stretching out before them, no longer a place of broken ground, but a place of unfolding change. And as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, the air shifted slightly, cooling just enough to carry the faint sound of something moving beneath the surface. Not a noise, not something that could be heard clearly, but a presence, the same quiet rhythm that had been there from the beginning, now felt more than ever before. And Ethan turned his gaze toward the barn, toward the hidden hatch beneath the soil, and he understood then that what his brother had left behind was not just a discovery to be made. It was a responsibility to be carried, not alone, but together. And that understanding did not weigh him down. It steadied him, grounding him in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. And Ranger rose slowly from where he lay, stretching once before walking toward them, his tail low but relaxed, his presence calm and certain. And he stopped beside Lily, nudging her hand gently before turning his gaze out across the field, as if reminding them both that this was not the end of something found, but the continuation of something that had only just begun. And Ethan looked down at the ground beneath his feet, then out toward the places they had yet to walk, the lines they had yet to follow. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to measure how far there was to go. He only felt the need to take the next step. And as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared faintly above them, the farm settled into a quiet that no longer felt empty, but full, filled with the kind of life that did not need to announce itself to be real. And standing there beside Lily and Ranger, Ethan understood that what had been left behind was not a burden. It was a trust, one that had been placed in his hands not because he was ready, but because he was willing. And sometimes that was enough to begin. Some legacies are not measured by what is left behind, but by what continues to grow after someone is gone. The morning came with a quiet clarity that felt different from the days before. the light stretching gently across the farm, as if it had learned how to settle into the land rather than pass over it. And Ethan stepped outside with a steadiness that had not been there when he first arrived, his breath slow, his thoughts no longer circling the past, but moving forward in quiet alignment with what the land had begun to reveal. And Ranger walked ahead as he always did now, not searching, not pausing, but guiding in a way that no longer needed to be questioned, while Lily followed just behind Ethan, her steps light but certain, her gaze no longer fixed on what had been lost, but on what was becoming. And together they moved toward the field where the first signs of growth had appeared, the faint green now more visible than before, still subtle, still fragile, but no longer something that could be dismissed as chance. And Ethan crouched near the edge of the patch, his hand pressing gently into the soil, feeling the cool firmness beneath his palm, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to listen, not with his ears, but with that quiet awareness that had been forming since the day they arrived. And the land answered in the only way it knew how, through the steady presence of something alive beneath the surface, something that did not rush, did not demand, but continued. And he opened his eyes again, a faint breath leaving him as he stood, and Lily stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with a quiet certainty. "It is growing because you stayed." And Ethan looked at her, the words settling into him with a weight that felt both simple and profound. And he shook his head slightly, not to disagree, but to adjust the meaning. "It was always growing," he said gently. "We just did not know how to see it." And Lily considered that for a moment, then nodded, her expression thoughtful, as if she was learning something that did not need to be explained in full, only understood in time. And Ranger moved a few steps ahead, stopping near the edge of the field where the ground dipped slightly, his ears lifting just enough to acknowledge something subtle, something constant. And Ethan followed, his steps steady, his gaze moving across the land with a clarity that had replaced the uncertainty he once carried. And as he reached the dip, he saw it again, not just the greener grass or the softer soil, but the pattern, the quiet network that connected everything beneath the surface. And he understood now that this was not something that would end with one discovery or one season. It was something that would continue as long as someone chose to remain and listen. And that realization did not feel overwhelming. It felt grounding, as if the responsibility he had accepted had also given him something in return, something steady to stand on. And behind him, Lily stepped forward, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, and she looked out over the field, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is still here." And Ethan did not look at her right away, his eyes remaining on the land, because he understood what she meant, not in a literal sense, but in the way that mattered, the way someone's presence could remain in the things they cared for, in the work they began, in the quiet intentions they left behind. And after a moment, he nodded, his voice calm. "Yeah, he is." And the words felt right, not because they changed anything, but because they acknowledged what had already been there. And the wind moved gently across the field, carrying with it the faint rustle of grass that had begun to take hold. And the barn stood quietly behind them, no longer a symbol of what had been broken, but a part of what was being rebuilt. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a steady light across the land, Ethan turned slightly, looking back toward the house, the porch, the path they had walked each day. And he realized that what had begun as something uncertain had become something steady, not complete, not finished, but real in a way that did not need to be proven. And he placed his hand lightly on Lily's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried more than words. And together they stood there with Ranger beside them, the farm stretching out in quiet promise. And for the first time, Ethan did not think about how long he would stay. He simply knew that leaving was no longer part of the story. Because some places are not meant to be passed through, they are meant to be lived in, slowly, patiently, until what was hidden begins to grow into something that can finally be seen. In the end, it was never about what he found beneath the ground, but what he chose to grow above it. The seasons did not change all at once, but over time the farm began to carry a quiet transformation that could be seen not in a single moment, but in the way each day added something small and steady to what had already begun. And Ethan no longer counted the days since he arrived, because time here no longer felt like something passing. It felt like something building, something layering itself into the land and into the rhythm of their lives. And the patches of green that had once been fragile now stretched farther across the field, connecting in ways that followed the hidden paths beneath the soil. The same paths his brother had mapped, the same ones Ranger had sensed before anyone else understood, and Ethan worked those paths with a patience that had become second nature, guiding the water gently, shaping the ground without forcing it, listening more than he acted, and in return, the land responded, not quickly, not dramatically, but faithfully, the kind of change that could only happen when something was given the time it needed to become what it was meant to be. And Lily changed too, in ways that were just as quiet, her steps no longer hesitant, her voice no longer held back, and there were moments now when she laughed without thinking, the sound light and clear as it carried across the field, and each time it did, Ethan felt something inside him settle a little more. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined everything that came after, and Ranger remained what he had always been, steady, watchful, present, moving through the farm with the same quiet awareness. But now his stillness felt different, not like he was searching for something hidden, but like he was guarding something that had already been found. And one evening, as the sun lowered once more over the horizon, casting that familiar golden light across the land, Ethan stood at the center of the field, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze moving slowly across everything that had begun to grow. And it was not perfect, not complete, but it was real, and that was enough. And Lily walked up beside him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation, her eyes following his across the land. And for a moment they stood there together in silence, not the kind that held questions, but the kind that held understanding. And she spoke softly, her voice steady. In the quiet air, "It feels like home now." And Ethan did not answer right away, because the words carried a weight that deserved to settle fully before being spoken back. And he looked down at her, then out across the farm again, the barn standing strong against the fading light, the field alive in ways it had not been before, the quiet presence of everything his brother had left behind now continuing in a way that did not need to be explained. And he nodded slowly, his voice calm. "Yeah, it does." And the words felt simple, but they carried something deeper, something that had taken time to grow into place. And the wind moved gently across the field, brushing through the grass, carrying with it the faint sound of life that no longer hid beneath the surface, but moved freely across it. And Ethan realized then that what had begun as something broken had never truly been lost. It had only been waiting for someone to stay long enough to understand it, waiting for someone willing to carry what had been left behind and continue it without needing to change it into something else. And as the last light of the day faded into the first quiet moments of night, Ethan felt no need to look back at what had been left behind, because everything that mattered had already been brought forward into this moment, into this place, into this life they had begun to build together. And standing there with Lily and Ranger beside him, the farm stretching out around them not as a reminder of loss, but as a promise of what could continue, he understood something that did not need to be written down or explained, something that could only be lived, that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not something you receive, but something you choose to protect, to nurture, and to pass forward, quietly, patiently, the way all meaningful things are meant to grow.